It's a great pleasure. It's an honor. I have nothing but admiration for everybody that I've listened to this morning. It's very, very moving testimonials and revelations about what everyone is living through. As we certainly are, moving towards closing out, in many ways, the most challenging year probably of our lives. Poetry it has a place, of course, in our lives more than ever, I believe, at this time. But it always has had a place. It is at the core of the human experience. I think of, and I wrote a book about that several years ago called Poetry as Spiritual Practice, which I have to, I love Carolyn Mays, and I know Carolyn was quoted in one of the sharings that was very beautiful. And, she has, I want to spend a moment with her, she has her own 7 sacred truths of the body and spirit, which I'll share. 1 is all is one. 2, honor one another. 3, honor oneself. 4, love is divine power. 5, surrender personal will to divine will. 6, seek only the truth. 7, live in the present moment. Now, Carolyn also says, once the soul announces itself, it requires attention. Poetry allows us, with our thought and our language, to pay attention and to pay attention to the soul. And I have to do this because it's it's like a softball lobbed over the plate and you just have to hit it. But Carolyn actually commented on this book, and she said, reading this lovely guide awakens in you a deeper appreciation for poetry and messages of the spirit. It communicates a poet's soul and helps you articulate that deep place of truth for yourself. That's a shameless blurb moment, but it also is appropriate because in talking about poetry as spiritual practice, she hits it right there, that deep place of truth for yourself. That's what poetry gives us. One of the things that I had to contend with in writing that book and thinking about that book, of course, was the fear of poetry, which is a kind of general fear that many, many people have. Well, I can't really write poetry, or I write poetry in secret, or, you have to be a member of a club or something. It's almost that feeling of, especially if you're in academia, where you have to, there's got to be some secrets, some keys to the kingdom before you could even attempt to write poetry. That's not true. My position is everybody writes poetry. Everybody can write poetry. Along Highway 101, no, it's on I-5, sorry, in Northern California. I love this. It's in the book somewhere, but I couldn't help quoting it. And this was very bad because I was writing this down feverishly while I was driving 80 miles an hour down I-5. One eye on the road, one eye on the notebook beside me, writing down these slogans. He was selling real estate, and he had billboards up on the side of the road, every 6 or 7 miles. And this went on for about 25 miles. And they were couplets. He had couplets that he had written about the property, these rhymed couplets, which stick in your mind. And I thought that's kind of brilliant. That's smart guy. He's a realtor that I'd like to meet. I'd have to get off in this small town and find him and ask, what did you do? How did you manage to do that? Anyway, that's kind of his spiritual practice. There's a famous meditation teacher in France who had a student who was having trouble with the teaching. This was at a retreat. He wrote about this, and he, this one student finally, raised her hand like the second day in the sharing period, and she said, I'm just not getting it. I don't feel anything. I don't know what my spiritual practice is, and the meditations we've done so far haven't helped me, and I'm lost. So he asked her a question. He said, what's the one thing you do in your morning when you're first up and what do you do that you love? And she had an interesting answer, very unpolitically correct answer. She said, I smoke a cigarette. I take 7 minutes and I go outside on my porch and I smoke a cigarette and I love it. And he just looked at her and he said, that's your spiritual practice. He said, work on that for now. Be totally in that moment and realize that you are present, so present in that moment. That's your practice right now. Your practice will change as everybody's practice evolves. But right now, smoking that cigarette for 7 minutes in the morning, that's obviously your practice. Embrace it. And of course, the whole point of spiritual practice is to embrace what we're doing, what we think we're doing. Poetry allows us to access that. And no matter what our practice is, it's another point that I really believe in. It doesn't matter what denomination you are or lack of denomination you are. I mean, if you're an atheist, that's your spiritual practice. If you're agnostic, that's your spiritual practice. But what every denomination or every inclination shares is the word. In the beginning was the word. Without the word, we can't communicate effectively. Yes, we can touch, we can pantomime, but the word is something we have that is so unique to us as a species. We have language. We can speak to each other, and our words heal, and a lot of healing words have been spoken here already this morning, but our words also, as we know, can harm. Our words can be weapons. But poetry allows us to cut through all of that, to refine our language, to refine our speech, and at the same time, teaches us to focus. Teaches us to focus. It teaches us how to access our daily experience and what is out there in what I always call the other realms, the world next to this one. The title of another book of mine, but it's I believe in that. I believe that the veils between worlds are very thin, and we have the opportunity to go through them or not. As witness this poem, for example, by William Butler Yeats, Ireland's greatest poet. It's called The Host of the Air. O'Driscoll drove with the song, the wild duck and the drake, from the tall tufted reeds of the drear heart lake. And he saw how the reeds grew dark with the coming of night tide. And he dreamt of the long, dim hair of Bridget, his bride. And he heard it high up in the air, a piper piping away. And never was piping so sad, and never was piping so gay. Then he saw young men and young girls dance on a level place, with Bridget, his bride, among them, with a sad and a gay face. The dancers gathered around him, and many a sweet thing said. A young man brought him red wine, and a young girl white bread. But Bridget drew him by the sleeve away from the merry band to old men playing at cards with the twinkling of ancient hands. So he sat and he played in a dream, never thinking of ill chance, till one bore Bridget, his bride, away to the merry dance. He bore her away in his arms, the handsomest young man there, and his neck and his breast and his arms were drowned in her long, dim hair. O'Driscoll scattered the cards and out of his dream awoke. And young men and old men and young girls were gone like a drifting smoke. And he heard it high up in the air, a piper piping away, and never was piping so sad, and never was piping so gay. That poem by Yeats, of course, is concerned and all about the balance between two worlds. It's a love poem. It's a loss poem. It's a poem of balance. As I say, he goes through the veil there in the dream sequence, and comes back, and there's a balance between the two. Of course, his wife is the elusive, mysterious wife, who has, interestingly, the name Bridget, who happens to be both a Catholic saint and a pagan goddess, and the three-headed mother of Ireland. So, and it's significant that he chose that name for the wife. I mean, it's a spiritual poem. It's a spiritual, well, all of his poems were a spiritual practice. Emily Dickinson is a great example of our American example of a poet whose poetry braided together her personal life and her spiritual life. A young woman who stopped going to church when she was a teenager. Yet her poetry, her body of poetry, nearly 2,000 poems, extraordinary poems. They are so religious and spiritual in their way. I shouldn't have used the word religion or religious. I take that back. You didn't hear that. I don't even know why I said that, because it must be so early in the morning. My mind is just that was a glitch. Spiritual is very different from religious, and we all know that. In any event, Dickinson teaches us in poem after poem that the significance of language refined to a white-hot art and a white-hot expression, yet that can still be expressed and understood by others. So, for example, she gives us a clue as to how we can handle our language with her poem that begins, she never titled her poems, but this one begins with, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, so truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind." What wisdom is in that? That simple expression of 7 or 8 lines. It's remarkable. It's a remarkable poem among many remarkable poems. I'll probably share a couple of more soon. Where does poetry come from? Where do we learn it? How do we first engage with poetry? And I've thought about this all my life, and I've asked many people over and over through the years around the world, where did you discover poetry? What was poetry like? And all of us have different answers, and it'd be nice to write them down. This is great journaling. It's a good journaling exercise to write down what are my first experiences of poetry. Mine are prosaic to others. They're meaningful to me. My mother playing the piano and singing songs while she played the piano, when I was a very small child. I remember that one of my earliest memories of childhood. That certainly moved me. Another important influence, and I say this unabashedly, was listening to Vin Scully broadcast Dodger games on my transistor radio when I was, before I was 10 years old, and frequently lying in bed with the transistor radio late at night, cheating, supposed to be asleep, but listening to the Dodger game, listening to Vin Scully describe games and tell his stories. He had as he does, he has an amazing inflection. He has great timing. He's anecdotal, and somehow none of it ever got in the way of broadcasting the game. I mean, he was one of a kind, and Los Angelinos were incredibly lucky to have him around all those years. He's still doing it, by the way, now on on Twitter and on Instagram. You can find him, and he tells little stories every day, like 3 or 4 minutes. But anyway, that was a great influence to me. Early on, Emily Dickinson, as I've mentioned already, was a great influence, and Yeats, terrific influence. I mean, I've been to Ireland many times. I've lived there. He has been, a guiding light for most of my adult life. Paul was asking, Dana was asking a question about Yeats that I saw come up on, sorry, I'm apologizing, on the bottom of my screen, but I didn't get the full question or statement. So if you want to throw that out, just anybody, by the way, can interrupt me, and questions are fine, and dialogue is fantastic, because that's what poetry does. As I said before, it should create community. Writing poetry can create community. We should get together as much as we can and talk about poetry and talk about.
Share, Robert.
Yeah?
Yes,
Yeah?
this is Rena.
Hi.
Hi, and you mentioned what is a moment that started us with poetry, and I flashed on a moment when I was 10 years old, and my mother asked me to hang the laundry outside, kind of on the lines. But I was really, really embarrassed because it was Yom Kippur, like the holiest day for the Jews, and everybody around me in Israel were going to synagogue and dressed in a very holy way. But my family did not practice that, and it was that moment of crisis of like my kind of feeling what was happening inside the home while outside the world seems holy. And I remember hanging the laundry and feeling like the drops of the water from the laundry were like tears, because I was like in some kind of a spiritual crisis as a 10-year-old, and that was a moment of poetry. And I went and I wrote about it, how the laundry was crying and kind of taking away our sins. I was looking for a way to participate in the holiness of the day, but it wasn't sure how to go about it because my parents were not religious.
You went about it the perfect way. I just got a chill when you described that. That's a beautiful image and an experience to see the water dripping off the laundry and thinking that the laundry was crying. That's
they were like my tears of wanted to wash and wanted to purify.
It was a beautiful metaphor, and at that moment, of course, you were more in the moment than ever. You were so present. And again, poetry brings that focus to us. It allows us to look at anything. It can be the laundry. I'm glad it's such a beautiful example because it's just incredible. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
I wish I'd written that. It's always a great, that's a great thing. T.S. Eliot said, bad poets imitate, good poets steal. And he was, I think that was somewhat tongue in cheek, but he meant it also, and he did steal. Yes, sure, yes. Hi,
Ronald. Yes.
Ronald.
I have a question for you. First of all, I love your voice because your voice makes poetry come alive to me. But I write tremendously every day on life experiences, and some would consider that poetry, but I can't. I've never understood poetry as I read it. I need someone to interpret what poetry means to me at the basic level, as opposed to my life experiences. When I read the books and so forth, I read them, make notes, but it doesn't mean anything.
That's many people have that experience. You're on the right track, and I'm going to tell a story that I hope it's I've always liked this story. I don't know if other people like it or not, but the famous poet Robert Browning, right? Robert Browning back 100 years ago, 150 years ago. Robert Browning, England's greatest poet at the time, gave a reading, and there's two stories actually about Browning. so first, this woman comes up to him after the reading, and she's, you know, I love your poetry, and I love, but you know, this line, what did you write? What were you really saying here? And Browning thought, and he said, my dear, when I wrote the line, only God and Robert Browning knew. Now only God knows. Which is, you know, which is true. There was another time that he was, well, I can think a more challenged person came up and, you know, like wanted to shake him or something about, you know, well, how do you read these long poems of yours? And his response was, one word at a time. And, you know, that's a good start too. We have to, sometimes I think when we read poetry, we have to slow down. I think we also have to trust ourselves that our instinct is probably frequently, well, mine is anyway, a lot more often my instinct is smarter than my intellect. And what I'm trying to force something to mean or force something to say. If I just, you know, if I can get to that point in a meditation, for example, and then read, sometimes, you know, I get the clarity of it. Emily Dickinson is considered by many a very difficult poet to read. Very cryptic, odd grammar, the line, you know, with her use of dashes and hesitations, very strange to read. And I confess, when I was a child, I had great difficulty reading her. I love the fact that I was reading her because that made me feel special. Because I was always in love with her. You know, I fell in love with the one photograph, the daguerreotype. This is how weird I am. This is the only definitely known photo of Emily Dickinson. So in grammar school, I always wanted, in high school, that's who I wanted to be my girlfriend. Now that made me pretty weird, just you know, weird. She was about 17 when that photograph was taken. Only one ever taken. The family hated it because they didn't think it looked like her. And she didn't think it, she didn't like it either. It would have been thrown away, but the maid kept it, and it was found in her trunk 30 years after Emily's death. So anyway, she's hard to read, but a lot of poets they seem to be hard to read. There's a way though, I would encourage, so meditation before reading, you could try that. That's worked for me sometimes. It is always good if you're really having trouble with a particular poet and you're so motivated, it's always good to find a good critic who has written about that poet. And sometimes that's a doorway in. But the best way, I think, is to have a little poetry circle, a poetry group, a poetry friend if you don't have a circle. Even one person is fantastic. To be able to talk about poems and talk about their difficulties with them or your joys in them. Again, you're getting the benefit of community there. You're getting the benefit of friendship. You're getting the benefit of, you know, working together on something that's, you know, a lot better than building a bomb, or you know, or for, you know, many of us, you know, it's more fun than like repairing the sink. I would encourage that. But I do say that, you know, I do believe that poetry is ultimately should be accessible to everyone and available to everyone, because that's where we have our great breakthroughs in communication, I think. I mean, if only you know, I mean, it's only in Shakespeare that it happens, but, you know, I mean, Julius Caesar. But I mean, imagine if, you know, imagine if Donald Trump and Joe Biden only spoke in rhymed couplets. Fantastic, right? I mean, you know, I mean, we'd feel better at least. I mean, just hearing that, we would feel better. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine. I picked the most ridiculous example, but, you know, wouldn't that be odd? Wouldn't that be refreshing?
Thank you very much.
And it's, you know, it's also, I'll say another thing about poetry. It's hard to lie in poetry. It's hard to be dishonest in poetry because it shows. The language is so stripped down, and needs to be, that it is difficult to lie, and it doesn't live on. there is no poem on earth ever written that has the currency of Mein Kampf. We know Mein Kampf is a book of hatred, filthiness, and lies, but it's there, and it's there as an example of that. There's no poem on earth that's like that. It just doesn't happen. So now I know that's an argument that can really be punctured pretty quickly, I suppose, by, if anybody cared to, but I'll stick with it. I mean, I know what I mean. It's poetry has an incisiveness and a directness that just comes right in here. It's not just fooling around up here, and it's not trying to convince you of anything or push you into something. It's an offering. It's an offering that goes back to when we sat around the campfires, before we had TV, when we lived with rocks and animals. That's what poetry is. It's that invocation. It's pre-writing, really. I mean, the first poetry for centuries was oral, only oral. We spoke poetry, and poetry entertained us. Poetry made us laugh. Poetry told us the news, literally. Poetry preserved the history of the tribe. And that's what poetry does, and it still does that. I know. I mean, we're living in an amazingly strange time where we have just so much information, and the media and everything is so constantly, you could say, assaulting us, or you could say it's enriching us. It depends on your point of view and how you feel. I think that it's good to be as positive as possible, even though I fear that I'm an inherently negative person deep down. But I try. I've worked very hard through spiritual practice for many, many years to be better than, to rise to the better nature of my angels. And I've been fortunate. I mean, I've been saved, but I was saved from death by an angel that I've actually saw once. That's a whole other story, but there is a poem about that. But I believe in striving to be kinder, more generous, more empathetic, wiser. And yes, the years do bring some of that if you get through the barnacles that the years also bring. But poetry has always been a constant companion and guide. And then, I always have someone like her to keep me straight, and she talks to me constantly. And I'm looking at her bigger picture of the daguerreotype right there on the wall. That is, by the way, right under the Yeats daguerreotype. So, there's some balance here. But, poetry is a way of life. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be a professional poet. It means that you pay attention to your language and your experience. And we all know from no matter what your spiritual practice is, there's a tenet about, be mindful of your speech. I said this at the very beginning when I began talking. Language can wound, can be like a weapon if we, and we have many, many examples of that every day that we come into contact with. It can be intentional, and it can also be unintentional. So that's what we have to, we have to pay attention to that. So, but getting back to, poetry, our experience of poetry, I was talking about the early, I diverge and digress a lot. I was talking about the experience of poetry, where we find poetry, and we all have different examples from very early times in our lives where we first experienced it. And again, I'd recommend writing about that. But I also want to share just poetry after that experience, after those experiences. Probably our next earliest experiences happen, in some form of church or synagogue or temple and school, and perhaps in the home, but nursery rhymes, hymns, religious hymns, chants, chanting. These are all forms of poetry. They're all forms of poetry. What did Bill say about Alcoholics Anonymous? Never had he seen so much of what Alcoholics Anonymous meant than he saw in the few lines of the Serenity Prayer. Well, the Serenity Prayer is a poem. You find poetry in any place you look, you will find a poem if you look. And they embrace you. They can wrap you up like a warm coat on a cold day. I mean, just listen to a few of these. You know these. The sun and moon are coming soon to breakfast with their fiddles. Get out of bed, you sleepyhead, and eat your healthy victuals. Now, this is a good one. This is one of my favorites because it's, I was fascinated by this one. I loved this one as a kid. Now I kind of hate it, and I'll explain why afterwards, but not really, but I do kind of, one part of it. Because it names the days of the week and attaches the days of the week to character, to one's character. There's that connection between something concrete, or if we say the days of the week are concrete, I mean, they're arbitrarily named too, but, and then they attach it to character. So here it is, you'll remember all this one. Monday's child is fair of face, and you'll be thinking about which one you are. Tuesday's child is full of grace. Wednesday's child is full of woe. Thursday's child has far to go. Friday's child is loving and giving. Saturday's child works hard for its living. But the child that is born on the Sabbath day is bonny and blithe and good and gay. So all of you can think, let's see. Yeah, I was born on the Monday, born on a Tuesday. I got really screwed by this poem, because I loved it when I was really young, but then when I got a little older, I thought I was born on Wednesday. Wednesday's child is full of woe. That's a kind of a lousy thing to carry around through your life, right? I mean, there's no way you can get out of it either. It's like, you're born on the day you're born. You can't you can change your own name, but you can't change the day you were born. I can't say suddenly, well, I want to be Monday's child, fair of face, or, Tuesday's child, full of grace. I mean, that's the best one, right? I don't know, but yeah. And then, poetry can give information, right? Poetry teaches us facts that we need, that at least society says we need to know. So, for example, 30 days hath September, April, June, and November. February has 28 alone. All the rest have 31, excepting leap year. That's the time when February's days are 29. How many times did you recite that in school? Yeah, I mean, I remember, okay, I get it. It was like learning the state capitals, okay, it's rote, right? You had to, okay, let's sing this out. But you realize later, and look, that's why I put it in the book, it's poetry. We learned from poetry. And I often think, we'd be a lot smarter if, about a lot of things, if we learned a lot more about from poetry rather than the way we normally learn. It's also important, I think, to note that just to remember that poetry comes from all over the world too. It's not just English poetry, of course, although I have these in translation. But Rabia, who was a poet who wrote, I've lost my place. Where did I do with Rabia? Here she is. Yeah. She was from Basra, and she's actually the most revered Islamic saint. But she was also a poet. And she wrote things like slicing potatoes. It helps me working my hands in a pot, swishing a broom in a wash pail. I tried painting, but I took flight far more easily by slicing potatoes. It's nice, And then she has this little, this is more, this is more aggressive, this next one, 3 lines. Who really knows anything about God? I know, many think they do, but they're just troublemakers. Now, another ancient poet, Tukaram, unschooled, but very influential mystic poet in the 17th century India. Because I could not lie, I named my dog God. Startled at first, soon he was smiling, then dancing. Now he won't even bite. Do you suppose this might work on people too? Shell game. This is also from Tukaram. 3 lines. God slipped into one of your pockets. Now you can always find him. Pretty good. Oh, well, there's this couplet he wrote. This is interesting too. This goes like this. There's a hole in the palace wall. A good poem is like that. A hole in the palace wall. Well, you can look in and you can look out. In other words, it's a device for observation, for observing. What can you see outer? What can you see inner? It's also therefore a metaphor for looking outside your soul and looking inside, looking within. Yes. Mirabai was a saint and a poet from India. She wrote lots of chants and hymns, songs, and they're recited by Hindus and Muslims to this day. God delights in women, for they hold the world to their breasts and help him comfort. These are poems that I would encourage everyone to write on their own. I mean, I have exercises where I ask students, for example, or participants of workshops to, write your own chant, write your own prayer, write, sit in a calm place, focus yourself, center yourself for about 10 minutes, focus on your breathing, and then take a pen up, a pencil up, sit at your keyboard and just write. And I always say, write for 5 minutes and don't stop. I mean, what I used to say when I taught a lot to students who would ask me, well, I can't get started. I've got writer's block. I said, yes, that's a real thing. What do you do for it? I said, well, I always open my notebook or I put down a piece of paper, I pick up my pen or pencil and I start moving it. And I said, something happens. Something happens. If you start moving that instrument on the page, something's going to happen. At the very least, maybe you'll get a great drawing. I mean, every now and then I just find I have these great doodles that I didn't even know I could draw. It's like fantastic. Wow, that's a gift. That's a side gift of poetry. So I would encourage that kind of waking up. I also talk about poetry as a waking up experience. The more that we come to poetry, the more we wake up. Emily has a great poem about this, which I'm going to share with you. Many of you probably may know this poem, if I can find it. There it is. Poem 303. No, it's not. Yes, it is. No, 33, sorry. And I'll talk about this poem after I've read it. There's a certain slant of light on winter afternoons that oppresses like the weight of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us. We can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it anything. 'Tis the seal, despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. Beautiful poem. One more time. There's a certain slant of light on winter afternoons that oppresses like the weight of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it anything, 'tis the seal, despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. I believe that the key to understanding poetry generally, not just Emily's poetry, but poetry at all, resides in her second stanza when she says, you know, heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar. What do we find when we really look? We find internal difference where the meanings are. Think about that for a moment. Internal difference. We have internal difference within us. Deep within us, we have internal difference, which we struggle to make sense of and turn and shape all our lives. And then if we're fortunate and we're successful at all, we find meaning. That's where the meanings are. We realize the deeper we go into the internal difference, the more successful we are in finding the meanings we've been seeking. The same is true, I think, also, as this great poem, it's also an outward thing. There is, of course, internal difference everywhere we look. One might say our societies are dysfunctional with internal difference. Yet, that's where the meanings are. So how diligent are we in going into those situations, those experiences, those cultures? How serious are we about understanding others? And how serious are we at getting to the point where we can appreciate and understand and feel compassion and empathy for the meanings that are important to Muslims, Hindi people, Buddhists, Christians. You see what I mean? I hope, or maybe not. But it just seems that, you know, it's always a thrill to come to the key in a poet's body of work where you think, that's exactly what she was after. That's exactly what she always did. She's looking at the internal difference where the meanings are. That's where the meanings are. She knows that. How she knew everything she knew is like, I've gradually come to the point where I think Emily was not really human, that she was sort of placed here through the veil for a certain period of time to do the work she did. And then when she was done, she went back. It's that simple. Because she's just, I mean, there's something, of course, very human about her, but she just, her work seems almost inhuman, I don't know. Anyway, by the way, this is completely apropos of nothing, but pause a moment on December 10th and celebrate the fact of her, because that is her 190th birthday. She's looking great, feeling good. So she'll be 190 on December 10th. And ironically, I don't even know if this is but there is there's a great television series that I recommend to everyone I talk to called Dickinson on Apple Plus TV. And you can watch the first season now. It's all available. Starring Haley Steinfeld, the brilliant young actress who was nominated for an Academy Award at the age of 14 when she was in True Grit 10 years ago, the Coen Brothers version. And anyway, her birthday just happens to be, she plays Emily and she's the best actress ever to play Emily. You know, I say that with deep regard and love for Julie Harris, but Haley brings the young rebellious, hot-blooded Emily Dickinson to life. And it's a fantastic watch. The cast is great, the writing's great. I recommend it. And the second season will premiere on January 8th. Anyway, Haley's birthday happens to be the day after Emily's.
Robert,
Yes.
we have a few minutes left. Can we
Okay.
hear some of your poetry?
Oh, well, you're right. I haven't done any of that, have I?
Can you do the angel?
Huh?
Can you do the angel?
Did I
You
what?
said that you
Oh,
said that
the
you wrote
angel
angel.
poem. God. What did I do with my books?
That's okay.
I had my own books just sitting here, and what did I do with them? I'm really embarrassed. I'm surrounded by books, but where are my books? I can't find them. This is embarrassing.
While you're looking for them, is there any chance you could work in Yeats' Second Coming?
The Second Coming. I don't have a copy of that here, and I'm sorry because that's a beautiful poem. It's one of my favorites. I don't know it by heart. I apologize. I adore that poem. I could work that in at another presentation, though.
Wonderful.
I
I
could do
almost
that.
have it memorized, but not completely.
You know, I'm going to have to pass on reading my own. This is really embarrassing, but
But Robert, I wonder if I imagine that some of your own poems you've memorized, and maybe just whatever one pops up first to share that with us.
yeah, I don't really have that. I have. I don't really have one of those that I can do. That
Oh, we can
easily.
do.
Maybe another morning might be in order too.
Sure.
I could. Thank you. Yes, I could do that. Right.
Oh, we can do business now and maybe foreclosure. We can do.
I
maybe we
like
can
to
find a poem in the
share.
next 10 minutes.
Oh, I like to share a poem that I learned when I was 5 years old. May I?
Okay.
So the poem's title is called The Andes, and I am originally from Peru. It goes like this. Silence, nothing moves. Suddenly, the llamas and vicuñas come at a very fast pace. Without butterflies or birds, an inhabited city stays. Nothing moves, just like a soul without love.
That's
I
beautiful.
learned that at 5.
Wow.
Ah.
I hope you kept writing. I hope you kept writing. through the years.
Sometimes.
That's beautiful.
So
Thank you.
Robert, I would like to ask if you could wrap up here in the next like 2-3 minutes for this.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have you back to do more readings. This has been wonderful.
Thank
So
you.
Just do a quick wrap up if you could.
Okay. Again, I think I'll wrap up. You know, I don't have the Second Coming, but I do have the Lake Isle of Innisfree, and I think that's a beautiful Yeats poem to end on. An early poem that also is really talking a lot about poetry. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there, of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall find some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of morning from where the crickets sing. There moonlight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for slowly night and day, I see lake water, I hear lake water lapping with low sounds along the shore. Whether I stand in the roadway or on the pavement's gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core. Poetry, he hears poetry. You know, the water lapping, the island itself, that's poetry. And no matter where he is, he carries that in his heart. He hears it, he feels it, it's all part of his body. Poetry becomes visceral. And that's how we can go through our happy days.